The sun, a weary eye on the verge of closing, bled its final light across the kitchen linoleum. Martha traced the faded pattern roses that had long since surrendered, their pink to a graying yellow with a slippered toe. The silence was a presence, thick and velvety, broken only by the familiar, arthritic complaint of the old house settling into its foundations. It was a silence she had earned, a silence that, for 62 years of marriage, had been a rare and stolen treasure. Her gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, a shrine to normalcy. There, smiling from a silver frame that needed polishing, was Harold. Harold with his hair swept back, a confident grin, the touch of his hand on her shoulder in the 1958 photograph looking possessive to anyone who didn't know the script. "Our golden anniversary," the frame declared. She remembered the party, the children's forced cheer, the cloying cake, the way Harold's hand had gripped her waist just a little too tightly as they posed, his thumb pressing a hidden bruise on her ribcage, a secret Morse code of pain only she could decipher. Everyone saw Harold Armstrong as a pillar, former town councilman, head usher at St. Luke's for 40 years, a man whose voice boomed with genial authority at Rotary Club dinners. They saw his polished shoes, his immaculate lawn, his wife who always had a fresh-baked pie cooling on the windowsill. They did not see the windowsill itself, how Martha had scrubbed it the morning after Harold threw a gravy boat at the wall, because a speck of dried parsley had offended him. They did not see the woman behind the pie. It began not with a fist, but with a word, a correction, sharp as a shard of glass, about how she'd folded his newspaper. Then it was the tone of her voice, too shrill, too meek, too present. Then it was the weight of his disappointment, a cold, heavy blanket that smothered the air in any room they shared. The first slap, on their first anniversary, had been so shocking she'd thought it a bizarre mistake. He'd been drunk on cheap champagne, angry about a comment she'd made about his mother. The sting on her cheek was eclipsed by the vertigo of a world tilting off its axis. "Look what you made me do," he whispered, his breath sour, his eyes already crafting the narrative. And she, young and pliable as warm wax, had believed him. She'd soothed him, her tears of fright becoming tears of apology. That was the cornerstone. Her fault. Always. The children came. Robert, then Susan. They were both anchors and vulnerabilities. The beatings grew careful. Strategic places hidden by clothes, the back of the thighs, the stomach, the scalp under her thick hair. The verbal lashings, however, were public, disguised as teasing. "Oh, don't mind Martha. She's a bit slow with figures. My wife, bless her, couldn't find her way out of a paper bag." Laughter would ripple, and Martha would smile a small, tight smile, her eyes fixed on a point far away, a place she called the quiet room. In her mind, Harold's violence was not a constant storm, but a climate, long periods of frigid normalcy, where he would speak to her only to issue directives, would be shattered by a sudden, brutal squall. A burnt pot roast could mean a night locked in the damp cellar. A misplaced tool was a shove down the porch steps. The worst was the silence after. The way he would read the newspaper at the kitchen table, the very picture of domestic peace, while she lay on their bed upstairs, pressing a cold washcloth to a split lip, listening to the rustle of pages and the calm, even rhythm of his breathing. The injustice of that calm was its own special torture. She thought of leaving. In 1972, after he'd broken her wrist for questioning a gambling debt, she'd packed a small bag for herself and the children. She'd gotten as far as the bus station, but the fear was a cage. Fear of his wrath, fear of the unknown, fear of the shame it would bring upon the family, a shame he had convinced her would be hers to bear. "Who would want you?" he'd sneered during one argument. "You're nothing without me." The words had seeped into her bones, becoming their own truth. So, she built a life within the life. She became a master of subterfuge. She cultivated a vast, invisible inner world. In the garden, her hands in the dark soil, she was a queen. Each tomato, each defiant sunflower, was a rebellion. She read library books voraciously, novels of adventure and love, poetry that spoke of landscapes her body could never visit. She whispered stories to her children at night, tales of brave maidens and kind dragons, pouring all the fierceness she couldn't show into the cadence of her voice. They were her oasis, Robert and Susan. Though she lived in terror that Harold's poison would touch them, she interposed herself, a human shield, taking the brunt of his moods to keep the tempest contained. To their marital chamber, the years folded into one another like layers of sedimentary rock, each stratum holding fossils of pain. Harold retired, and his presence in the house became a permanent, low-pressure system. His criticisms grew more petty, his need for control more absolute. Martha learned the precise angle to hang a towel, the exact simmer for his oatmeal, the timbre of voice that was least likely to provoke. She became a ghost in her own home, moving silently, efficiently, leaving no trace of herself except the demanded results. Then, 3 years ago, the balance of power began to subtly, infinitesimally shift. Harold's heart, that engine of relentless anger, began to falter. A minor attack, then a bypass. He shriveled into a husk of his former self, tethered to an oxygen tank, his booms reduced to wheezes. The violence turned to a bitter, helpless vitriol. He would throw a pill bottle, but it would arc pathetically and land on the rug. He would call her names, but his voice was a thin, reedy thing. Martha, the prisoner, became the warden. She changed his bedpans, prepared his bland meals, adjusted his oxygen. She did it without kindness, but without cruelty, with a steady, detached efficiency that seemed to infuriate him more than any retaliation. The hatred in his milky blue eyes was pure and undiluted now, but it was powerless. She held the glass of water just beyond his reach for a beat too long. She turned off the television he was watching without a word. Small, silent rebellions that were atomic in their significance. He died on a Tuesday. She found him in his armchair, his mouth agape, the newspaper on his lap. There was no dramatic death rattle, no final confrontation. Just a cessation. She stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the morning light creep across his lifeless knuckles. She felt nothing. A vast, echoing nothing. Then, she turned, walked to the kitchen, and made herself a cup of tea, her hands perfectly steady. The funeral was a masterpiece of hypocrisy. Robert and Susan, now middle-aged with children of their own, flew in. They spoke of their father's strength, his dedication, his love for his family. Martha, dressed in a black dress she'd owned for a decade, sat in the front pew, her face a placid mask. Neighbors patted her hand. "So sorry for your loss, Martha. He was a wonderful man. You must be so lonely." Lonely, she thought. I have been lonely in a crowded room for 6 decades. This silence is different. After the last casserole dish was reclaimed and the children returned to their distant lives, the house was truly hers. The silence was no longer an anxious pause between storms, but a deep, resonant peace. She began, tentatively, to exist. She moved Harold's recliner to the curb. She painted the kitchen a soft, buttery yellow, covering the drab green he'd insisted upon. She bought a radio and played classical music in the afternoons, something he had called noise. She let the roses in the garden grow wild and tangled. One afternoon, while clearing out the attic, she found a dusty leather case. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a set of watercolor paints and a pad of paper. A girlhood gift, long forgotten. On a whim, she took it downstairs. The next morning, instead of starting laundry, she filled a jam jar with water, set up the pad on the kitchen table now bathed in her yellow light, and wet a brush. She touched the crimson to the paper. A bloom appeared, soft and blurry at the edges. She added a stem, a leaf. It was clumsy, childlike. A sob welled up in her throat, but it was not a sob of sadness. It was the physical manifestation of a door creaking open after a century, of being sealed shut. She painted another, and another. Weeks later, emboldened, she signed up for a painting class at the community center. The woman at the desk was young enough to be her granddaughter. "Beginner's watercolor, Wednesdays at 10, she said brightly. Martha simply nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs as if she were committing a crime. The class was full of chatty retirees. Martha was silent, absorbing everything. Her first landscapes were timid, her colors muddy. But under the gentle guidance of the teacher, a free-spirited woman named Elena, she began to loosen up. She learned to mix a thrilling cerulean blue, to layer washes, to suggest a forest with a few deft strokes. One Wednesday, she painted not the demo bowl of fruit, but a memory. The view from her childhood bedroom window, the old oak tree, the field beyond. It poured out of her, vivid and alive. Elena stopped behind her. "Martha," she said, her voice soft with awe. "That's extraordinary. It's full of feeling." No one had ever described anything of Martha's as extraordinary. Tears pricked her eyes. She merely nodded. Painting became her language, the one she had never been allowed to speak. She painted the hidden bruises of her soul. Dark, turbulent skies giving way to streaks of defiant gold. Vases of flowers, some bright and triumphant, others wilting under invisible shadows. Self-portraits were her eyes. Finally, held the gaze of the viewer, steady and unflinching. Susan called one evening. "How are you holding up, Mom?" "I'm well, dear. I've taken up painting." A pause. "Painting? That's nice. A good hobby. Keeps you busy." Martha looked at her latest work propped on the mantel, next to the silver-framed lie. It was an abstract swirl of deep blues and purples, with a single, fierce stroke of vermilion cutting through the center. It was titled, in her mind, 62 Years. "Yes," Martha said, a faint smile in her voice. "It keeps me busy." A year after Harold's death, the local library held a small exhibition for the students of Elena's classes. Martha submitted 3 pieces. One was the childhood landscape. Another was a detailed, almost botanical study of a magnolia blossom from her garden. The third was the abstract, the vermilion slash. She listed it as emergence. On the night of the exhibition, she dressed with care in a simple linen dress the color of a lilac dusk. She stood in her living room, looking at the mantel. She took down the silver anniversary frame. She didn't throw it away. She simply placed it in a drawer. In its stead, she propped up emergence. The library was buzzing. Martha hovered near the punch bowl, a flutter of nerves in her stomach. She saw her paintings on the wall, with small red dots on their labels. Sold. All 3. A wave of dizziness passed over her. "Martha Armstrong?" A man approached her, holding a business card. He was the curator of a larger gallery in the city. "I'm fascinated by your work," he said, "particularly the abstract. There's a story there, a powerful one. Do you have more?" She looked at him, this stranger seeing not a grandmother, not a widow, but an artist. She saw her reflection in his glasses, an old woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much, but were now clear and bright. "Yes," she said, her voice firm, a voice she barely recognized as her own. "I believe I do." That night, she returned to her yellow kitchen. The house was silent, but it was a silence that sang. She boiled the kettle, but instead of tea, she poured a small sherry, a drink Harold had forbidden. She took it to her easel, sat up now in the living room where his chair had been. She looked at the blank sheet of paper, pristine with possibility. She loaded her brush with the deepest black she could mix. Then, with a hand that did not tremble, she began to paint her story. Not the story of the beaten wife, the silent ghost, but the story of the survivor. The story of the woman who emerged, at last, from the long winter of a cruel marriage, into the fierce, brilliant, and unforgiving spring of her own becoming. The brushstrokes were bold, the colors defiant. She painted through the night, and as the first rays of dawn, a new sun, a new day touched the edge of her paper. Martha Armstrong, age 82, finally began to live.